In early 1945, as the Allies pushed into the heartland of Nazi Germany, the ancient city of Breslau stood as a final stronghold, destined to become one of the war's longest and bloodiest sieges. Known as Fortress Breslau, this city would defy overwhelming Soviet forces until Germany itself had fallen. The roots of this tragic resistance lay deeply embedded in the chaotic collapse of Hitler's empire, fueled by desperation, fanatical loyalty, and strategic necessity. Geopolitically, Breslau, capital of Lower Silesia, was critically positioned. Historically German, but surrounded by territories coveted by Poland and contested by the Soviet Union, the city held symbolic and strategic significance. The Nazi regime had declared Breslau a fortress city as early as August 1944, determined it would never surrender. This uncompromising stance reflected Hitler's hold-at-all-costs strategy, transforming urban centers into fortified zones to slow the advancing Red Army. Military preparedness within the city was patchy at best, bolstered by civilian labor hastily mobilized to erect defenses, including trenches and barricades. Yet beneath this outward defiance lay uncertainty and fear. Intelligence estimates from German high command revealed the stark reality. Breslau was isolated, vulnerable, and significantly undermanned. Public sentiment, initially defiant and patriotic, gradually became overshadowed by fear of encirclement, bombardment, and occupation, conditions that would soon become realities. The stage was set for a bitter confrontation that would symbolize the devastating collapse of Nazi Germany's Eastern Front. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched its massive winter offensive. Known as the Vistula-Oder Offensive, this sweeping maneuver aimed at cutting deep into German-held territories. Breslau, identified as a key objective, quickly found itself under threat. Initial Soviet movements rapidly isolated the city, encircling it by mid-February. The German commander, General Hans von Alphen, assumed the daunting task of defending the city, now completely surrounded and cut off from German lines. Within days, the first Soviet artillery shells struck Breslau, initiating an unrelenting siege. Strategic goals of both sides quickly crystallized. The Soviet High Command intended Breslau's rapid fall, aiming to secure a crucial logistical and transportation hub. Stalin's generals calculated that seizing Breslau quickly would free resources needed elsewhere, notably for the decisive final assault on Berlin. Conversely, Nazi propaganda elevated Breslau's defense as a patriotic duty. Its stubborn resistance was intended to tie down Soviet forces, buying time for defensive preparations deeper inside Germany, particularly around Berlin. Tragically, these strategies rested heavily on illusions and propaganda, rather than sound military logic. The first significant engagements around Breslau were fierce and chaotic. The city's defenders, composed of regular Wehrmacht troops, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth, faced superior Soviet armor and infantry divisions, backed by relentless artillery bombardment. Neighborhoods became battlegrounds, and initial territorial shifts saw suburbs changing hands multiple times. Civilian casualties mounted swiftly, exacerbated by shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Morale fluctuated dramatically. Initial determination quickly tempered by despair at the scale of devastation and seemingly endless siege warfare. As February turned into March, the siege escalated into full-blown crisis. Harsh winter weather compounded the suffering, immobilizing both attackers and defenders in bitter, frozen combat. Soviet commanders, frustrated by unexpectedly stiff German resistance, increased artillery barrages, reducing much of Breslau to rubble. German defensive lines contracted, forced back street by street, block by block. Political tensions within German leadership intensified, driven by feudal orders from Berlin demanding resistance without retreat, even as realities on the ground deteriorated. The siege reached its brutal peak in March and April 1945. Soviet troops launched multiple assaults, employing tanks, heavy artillery, and airstrikes to break the defenders' will. High command on both sides made crucial, costly decisions. German commanders authorized desperate counterattacks aimed at regaining lost territory, each resulting in high casualties with little strategic gain. Civilians trapped inside Breslau faced daily terror. Death, injury, starvation, and a mounting humanitarian catastrophe as infrastructure collapsed entirely under sustained bombardment. Despite worsening conditions, Breslau's defenders demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptation. Utilizing improvised defensive tactics, small units launched frequent disruptive counterattacks that slowed Soviet advances. Resourceful citizens scavenged supplies and constructed makeshift defenses from the debris of destroyed buildings. Psychological pressures, however, grew immense. Soldiers and civilians alike endured constant bombardment, scarcity of supplies, and deteriorating morale, sustained only by propaganda and fear of Soviet occupation. The turning point arrived decisively in late April 1945, coinciding with the broader collapse of German resistance elsewhere. With Berlin falling and Hitler dead, Breslau's strategic value vanished. Isolated, starved, and overwhelmed, German commanders finally recognized the futility of continued resistance. On May 6, 1945, Breslau capitulated after an astonishing 82 days of siege. Soviet forces, exhausted and heavily bloodied by the unexpectedly prolonged battle, occupied a city reduced largely to ruins. The surrender marked not only a military defeat, but also symbolized the utter futility of Nazi Germany's fanatic fight-to-the-last-man doctrine. In the immediate aftermath, Breslau was a shattered city. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, and infrastructure was obliterated. German residents faced brutal reprisals and mass expulsions, forcibly removed to make way for Polish settlers under post-war territorial adjustments. The humanitarian crisis was severe. Disease, starvation, and violence plagued the city long after the guns fell silent. The once proud city of Breslau became the Polish city of Wrocław, its German identity erased amid post-war geopolitical realignment. The legacy of Fortress Breslau remains potent and complex. Militarily, the siege symbolized the fanatical extremes of Nazi Germany's collapse, where strategic irrationality replaced pragmatic considerations. Politically, the fate of Breslau mirrored the broader fate of Eastern Europe, caught between competing ideologies and forcibly reshaped by wartime devastation and post-war treaties. Culturally and historically, debates linger regarding the ethics and consequences of Breslau's resistance. Today, commemorations and memorials reflect varying perspectives: heroic defiance to some, tragic futility to others, and a stark reminder of war's catastrophic human cost. Fortress Breslau, defiant to its tragic end, endures in history as a testament to human determination, strategic folly, and the brutal consequences of ideological warfare. By mid-January 1945, the Eastern Front had disintegrated rapidly, sending shockwaves of panic and desperation rippling through Nazi Germany's leadership. The once seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was now retreating on every front, and Adolf Hitler's vision of an impregnable Third Reich crumbled before the unstoppable Soviet onslaught. The Red Army's massive Vistula-Oder offensive, initiated on January 12th, had punctured German defenses like never before. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konyev's First Ukrainian Front surged westward, swiftly breaking through enemy lines and aiming directly for Berlin. Their advance was relentless, terrifying in its momentum, and unprecedented in scale. Amid this catastrophic situation, Breslau, today known as Wrocław, emerged as a key battleground, identified by Nazi leadership as a crucial stronghold to halt the Soviet tide. Hitler had earlier declared Breslau a Festung, or fortress city, a designation that was as much psychological as it was strategic. Festung Breslau was to become a symbol of defiance, a bastion where the Wehrmacht, reinforced by hastily assembled Volkssturm militias and Hitler Youth units, would theoretically repel Soviet forces and stabilize the collapsing front. The man appointed to oversee Breslau's defense was General Hans von Alphen, an experienced commander thrust suddenly into an impossible scenario. Upon assuming command in late January, von Alphen faced a daunting task. Breslau's fortifications were incomplete, hastily constructed by civilian labor, including women, elderly men, and teenagers, all pressed into emergency service. Trenches, tank traps, barricades, and makeshift bunkers scarred the once grand streets, transforming the historic city into a grim landscape ready for siege warfare. Initial Soviet movements toward Breslau were swift and decisive. By late January, forward elements of the Soviet Sixth Army, under General Vladimir Gluzdovsky, had closed rapidly around the outskirts of Breslau, cutting off the city from essential rail lines and highways. Almost immediately, the population faced isolation and uncertainty. Their city turned overnight into a frontline fortress. Essential supplies, food, ammunition, and reinforcements dwindled alarmingly. Despite Nazi propaganda portraying a unified and resilient city, Breslau's reality was far darker. Confusion and anxiety plagued the city's residents, exacerbated by the rapid Soviet encirclement that had caught many unprepared. On February 13th, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Breslau, effectively sealing the city off entirely. The first Soviet artillery shells began raining down, signaling the opening salvos of what would become one of World War II's longest urban sieges. Early bombardments inflicted immediate psychological shock upon Breslau's residents. Fires erupted across the city, ignited by explosive shells and intensified by strong winds that swept through streets and squares. Historic buildings, churches, and homes became rubble-strewn ruins, their destruction marking the start of a bitter battle for every street corner. Inside Breslau, General von Alphen faced increasingly difficult choices. With limited troops at his disposal and supplies severely curtailed, he adopted a defensive strategy focused on holding fortified city districts while conceding less defensible suburbs. His leadership, though resolute, was marked by grim realism. He recognized that without substantial reinforcements, which Berlin was incapable of providing, Breslau's prospects of successfully resisting the Red Army indefinitely were negligible. Yet, Nazi leadership, committed to their vision of heroic defiance, demanded resistance at all costs, turning the siege into a tragic spectacle of ideological fanaticism rather than strategic pragmatism. Civilians trapped inside the besieged city bore the brunt of early combat. Streets became deadly corridors of crossfire, with civilians frequently caught in the fighting or targeted by indiscriminate artillery strikes. Breslau's residents endured unimaginable hardships from the onset of the siege. Food rationing quickly descended into starvation as supply lines collapsed. Medical care became scarce, with hospitals overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Epidemics loomed ominously as sanitation infrastructure disintegrated under constant bombardment. Despite official propaganda celebrating civilian resilience and heroism, daily reality was increasingly defined by fear, deprivation, and despair. Within days of complete encirclement, Soviet infantry assaults intensified, aiming at systematically reducing German defenses street by street. The Wehrmacht troops, reinforced by inexperienced but fanatical Volkssturm and Hitler Youth fighters, mounted fierce resistance, managing temporary successes through tactical improvisation. Snipers operated from shattered buildings, ambushing Soviet patrols and slowing their advance. Anti-tank teams fought desperately to halt Soviet armor, often at suicidal odds. While these tactics slowed Soviet momentum, they could not alter the fundamental strategic imbalance. Each battle further drained Breslau's limited manpower and ammunition reserves, hastening the city's slow and inevitable strangulation. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders faced their own challenges. Breslau's stubborn resistance forced the Red Army to commit greater resources and manpower than initially expected, disrupting their overall strategic timetable. Soviet losses began mounting, reflecting the brutal cost of urban warfare. Soviet officers soon realized Breslau would not fall as easily as anticipated, prompting a reassessment of tactical approaches. Initial hopes for a swift capture faded rapidly, replaced by a determination to crush German resistance through attrition and continuous bombardment. By the end of February, Breslau had already suffered enormous damage. Once elegant streets lay gutted and burning, public squares turned into wastelands of shattered masonry. Casualties mounted steadily, and morale among defenders and civilians alike was strained nearly to breaking point. Yet Nazi leadership continued broadcasting assurances of imminent relief, prolonging false hopes while demanding continued sacrifice. For the Red Army, Breslau's siege represented both a frustrating obstacle and a necessary demonstration of resolve. Stalin's generals understood that every day of Breslau's resistance delayed critical reinforcements needed for the looming assault on Berlin itself. Yet the city had become a symbolic prize, a measure of Soviet strength and determination. As February drew to a close, it was clear the siege had become far more than a mere military engagement. It had evolved into a harrowing test of endurance, strategy, and human willpower. Thus, as February turned into March, Fortress Breslau, now a devastated urban battleground, prepared itself for even more savage and prolonged combat, foreshadowing a siege whose grim intensity would only deepen in the weeks ahead. As March 1945 dawned over Fortress Breslau, the city was already ravaged, its skyline reduced to blackened ruins. Soviet commanders initially believed Breslau would capitulate quickly, but weeks of entrenched resistance had proven otherwise. Breslau's stubborn defense had become a strategic irritant, diverting Soviet resources away from the primary goal, Berlin. Both sides understood that the battle for Breslau was now a prolonged siege, characterized by desperate fighting, shortages, and growing despair. Strategically, Breslau had transformed into a tragic embodiment of Adolf Hitler's ideological insistence on no retreat, no surrender. The Nazi high command persisted in its unrealistic expectations of relief operations, promising support that neither existed nor could be delivered. General von Alphen, however, faced a stark reality on the ground. He needed to sustain morale among his weary defenders, all while contending with severely limited supplies and shrinking territory. Inside the city, the logistical nightmare was growing more acute by the day. Breslau's original population of approximately 6,000 Medborgers had swelled due to refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. With the encirclement complete, the city became an isolated island amidst a sea of enemy forces. Food supplies dwindled alarmingly, prompting strict rationing. Residents resorted to desperate measures, consuming anything remotely edible, from horses to household pets, in a grim effort to stave off starvation. Fresh water, too, became a luxury, as damaged infrastructure rendered taps useless, forcing residents to queue at public fountains or scavenge melting snow. For Soviet commanders, capturing Breslau was imperative. Stalin considered the city strategically vital, not merely because of its railways and industrial facilities, but due to its symbolic significance. Breslau's fall would demonstrate the Red Army's unstoppable march toward victory, further demoralizing the already crumbling German resistance. Marshal Ivan Konev demanded rapid results, pressing his subordinate commanders to accelerate assaults despite the mounting losses and tactical stalemate. Soviet planning evolved rapidly as commanders learned bitter lessons from initial setbacks. Infantry assaults alone had proven costly, so Soviet generals increasingly turned to artillery bombardments and aerial strikes to soften Breslau's entrenched defenses. Their strategy focused on systematically reducing strong points within the city, block by block, house by house, and cellar by cellar, using overwhelming firepower to limit infantry casualties. However, the city's defenders utilized the dense urban terrain to mount highly effective guerrilla-style counterattacks, frustrating Soviet attempts to gain decisive breakthroughs. German defenders employed ingenious and sometimes ruthless defensive tactics. Buildings were rigged with explosives to collapse upon advancing Soviet troops, transforming homes and businesses into lethal booby traps. Narrow streets became death traps for Soviet armor, targeted by hidden anti-tank teams, armed with Panzerfausts and improvised explosives. Civilian basements and cellars became interconnected networks of tunnels and command posts, facilitating rapid troop movements under cover. Although desperately short of manpower and resources, Breslau's defenders were expert improvisers, making formidable use of limited means to maximize their defensive capabilities. Still, strategic miscalculations and unrealistic demands from Berlin severely undermined the city's defense. Nazi propaganda, intended to bolster morale, became increasingly divorced from reality. Constant promises of imminent reinforcement bred cynicism and resentment among soldiers and civilians alike, many of whom recognized the propaganda as hollow words. High Command's refusal to authorize tactical retreats forced defenders to hold untenable positions until overwhelmed or annihilated, wasting lives and further damaging morale. Civilians bore an immense psychological toll during this relentless siege. Sheltering beneath ruins amid ceaseless shelling, Breslau's residents endured unspeakable hardships. Families huddled in dark, overcrowded shelters, subsisting on meager rations, often without electricity or sanitation. Children grew accustomed to the constant sound of explosions, their lives defined by deprivation and fear. Despite widespread exhaustion and despair, many civilians actively contributed to the city's defense, motivated by patriotism, coercion, or simple desperation. On the outskirts, Soviet commanders struggled to balance their strategic imperative with mounting frustrations. Attrition was painfully apparent. Soviet troops suffered heavy casualties, attempting to penetrate Breslau's well-entrenched defenses. Despite superior numbers and firepower, the Red Army repeatedly found itself bogged down in protracted urban combat. Each block conquered exacted a heavy price, forcing Soviet commanders to reassess their tactics repeatedly, shifting from direct assaults to methodical artillery barrages and siege warfare. One particularly destructive tactic adopted by the Soviets involved the systematic use of incendiary shells and bombs, deliberately igniting Breslau's historic center to flush out defenders. Fires raged unchecked, reducing large sections of the city to smoldering rubble. Iconic landmarks, including the renowned Gothic churches and stately townhouses, collapsed into ruins, symbolizing the profound cultural devastation inflicted upon Breslau. As March wore on, Breslau became increasingly isolated, desperate, and devastated. Yet, despite the grim reality, defenders continued resisting fiercely. Military discipline held, though strained by exhaustion, hunger, and mounting despair. By now, both attackers and defenders knew the siege would not end easily or swiftly. Instead, it had devolved into a grim endurance test, defined by daily attrition and unimaginable human suffering. Thus, as Breslau entered April 1945, the fortress city, once a thriving cultural jewel, had become a nightmarish battlefield, a stark embodiment of total war's destructive capacity. The siege's escalating brutality offered no respite or mercy, ensuring that the coming weeks would witness even greater tragedy and devastation. By early April 1945, the siege of Fortress Breslau had descended into relentless, bitter fighting, turning the once prosperous cultural center into an apocalyptic wasteland. Soviet forces, determined to crush the city's stubborn resistance, intensified their bombardment, raining shells and bombs upon Breslau with ferocious regularity. Inside the encircled fortress, conditions deteriorated rapidly, plunging both defenders and civilians into an increasingly desperate struggle for survival. As Soviet commanders reassessed their approach, they realized that traditional infantry attacks alone were inadequate to break Breslau's defensive grip. Instead, they shifted towards systematic, heavy artillery barrages combined with calculated infantry assaults, carefully orchestrated to dismantle German defenses district by district. Marshal Ivan Konev authorized the deployment of additional heavy artillery units and air support, aiming to reduce the city to rubble and thereby minimize further Soviet losses in direct combat. These sustained bombardments transformed the urban landscape into a surreal expanse of burning ruins. Breslau's renowned medieval core and elegant avenues, historically celebrated for their architectural beauty, now smoldered and collapsed into twisted heaps of masonry. Historic landmarks such as the iconic Breslau Cathedral and the university were severely damaged or destroyed, emblematic of the cultural catastrophe unfolding within the city. In response to these intensified attacks, German defenders demonstrated remarkable, albeit desperate, ingenuity. General Hans von Olfen, still tasked with the city's defense, was relieved by General Hermann Niehoff on April 2nd, as Nazi leadership sought more determined, fanatical resistance. Niehoff immediately issued orders reflecting a heightened determination to hold every inch of ground, reinforcing key defensive positions, even at significant human cost. Buildings were converted into fortified strongpoints, equipped with machine gun nests and anti-tank weaponry, Crucially, Breslau's defenders increasingly resorted to sabotage tactics, laying elaborate booby traps and improvised explosive devices throughout the city, further complicating Soviet advances. The grim daily reality for German troops entrenched within Breslau grew progressively unbearable. Ammunition shortages became chronic, forcing soldiers to ration bullets and artillery shells carefully, often relying on close-quarters combat. Food scarcity was extreme. Soldiers subsisted on starvation rations, frequently scavenging whatever minimal sustenance could be gleaned from abandoned cellars or looted stores. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals, set up in cellars, tunnels, and shattered buildings, their conditions rapidly deteriorating due to inadequate medical supplies and sanitation. Civilian suffering within Breslau reached catastrophic proportions. The relentless shelling forced thousands underground into crowded, unsanitary bomb shelters, basements, and hastily dug trenches. The lack of food was devastating. Desperate residents scoured ruins for scraps of nourishment, resorting increasingly to consuming horses, rats, and even tree bark. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly, exacerbated by the collapse of healthcare infrastructure and absence of fresh water. Despite these horrific conditions, propaganda continued to permeate Breslau's battered streets. Nazi radio broadcasts constantly proclaimed imminent relief and ultimate victory, a cruel deception that kept morale artificially buoyant, yet eroded trust among civilians and exhausted defenders alike. By early April, cynicism and disillusionment had set in profoundly, yet resistance continued, driven by fear of Soviet retribution and ideological indoctrination. Soviet morale also fluctuated significantly during this period. Breslau had become a costly enterprise, draining manpower and supplies that Soviet commanders urgently required elsewhere, particularly for their planned final assault on Berlin. Casualty rates among Red Army units attacking Breslau soared, with infantry assaults frequently stalling under determined German counterattacks or intense defensive fire from fortified positions. Frustration among Soviet commanders manifested as increasingly ruthless tactics, including purposeful destruction of entire neighborhoods to remove cover and concealment for German snipers and defenders. Amidst this turmoil, Breslau witnessed significant shifts in civilian military dynamics. Women, children, and elderly citizens were pressed into labor battalions, repairing defenses, constructing barricades, and transporting ammunition under constant fire. Tragically, many of these civilians became direct casualties of combat, their contributions to the defense overshadowed by the horrific toll inflicted upon them. Those unable to participate actively, especially children and the infirm, faced dire abandonment and neglect, their survival chances diminishing sharply as the siege wore on. Soviet forces, attempting a decisive breakthrough in early to mid-April, launched aggressive assaults in critical sectors of the city, particularly targeting the southern districts. The fighting here reached extraordinary intensity, with Soviet troops utilizing flamethrowers and heavy artillery to systematically clear German-held buildings. The Wehrmacht and Volkssturm defenders fought fanatically, determined to exact the highest possible cost for every inch of ground ceded. Street combat devolved into brutal hand-to-hand encounters, characterized by grenade duels, sniper fire, and intense small unit engagements within the claustrophobic confines of shattered buildings. Despite Soviet gains, the anticipated rapid collapse of Breslau's defenses failed to materialize, highlighting the surprising resilience and tactical adaptability of the German defenders. Frustrated Soviet commanders, facing mounting losses and political pressure from Moscow to secure the city quickly, intensified their assault strategy further, escalating the destructive potential of their operations. As April advanced toward its midpoint, Fortress Breslau stood as an increasingly tragic symbol, defiant yet doomed, resilient yet ruined. The city's continued resistance posed uncomfortable questions for both Soviet attackers and Nazi leadership. How much longer could Breslau realistically hold, and at what additional human cost? These harrowing weeks of escalating combat prepared Breslau for its most devastating phase yet, setting the stage for the siege's violent climax, a battle defined by desperate resistance, strategic futility, and unimaginable suffering. By mid-April 1945, Fortress Breslau had descended into a grim spectacle of devastation and suffering. The siege had already surpassed the expectations of both Soviet and German commanders, transforming the city into a horrifying crucible of endurance, loss, and desperation. The Red Army, now determined to finally break the defenders' resolve, escalated the intensity of their assaults, employing brutal tactics to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Yet, Breslau's weary defenders continued to resist ferociously, driven by a mixture of fear, fanaticism, and dwindling hopes for survival. General Hermann Niehoff, having replaced General von Alphen at the start of April, now faced the daunting challenge of holding a city that was effectively lost. Niehoff was a seasoned officer, known for determination and discipline. However, even his experience could not conceal the stark reality he inherited. Depleted ammunition, shattered morale, rampant disease, and overwhelming Soviet firepower. His immediate task was to stabilize the defense, but the dire strategic situation forced him into increasingly desperate improvisation, as every attempt at relief or reinforcement from Berlin proved illusory. Niehoff swiftly reorganized Breslau's remaining defenders into smaller, more flexible units, emphasizing guerrilla-style urban warfare. Under his orders, fortified strongpoints were interconnected by tunnels and covered trenches, allowing rapid troop movement amid the ruins, often under direct Soviet bombardment. Machine gun nests and sniper positions were cunningly concealed within rubble-strewn buildings, creating deadly killing zones for Soviet infantry. These tactical adjustments, although effective at prolonging resistance, came at immense human cost, as units often found themselves isolated and annihilated once their positions were uncovered. For Soviet commanders, patience was wearing thin. Marshal Ivan Konev, determined to capture Breslau quickly and redirect forces toward Berlin, demanded rapid progress. Soviet artillery batteries intensified their bombardment, systematically obliterating entire neighborhoods to deny defenders shelter. Thousands of incendiary shells rained down upon the city, igniting enormous fires that devoured what little remained of Breslau's historic buildings. Under Soviet directives, soldiers increasingly adopted merciless tactics, methodically razing any structure suspected of harboring German fighters, effectively obliterating the urban landscape block by block. The catastrophic human cost of these tactics was most apparent among Breslau's civilian population. Civilians, trapped beneath continuous shellfire, endured nightmarish conditions, their lives confined to dark cellars and makeshift shelters. Starvation had reached epidemic proportions, leading desperate residents to hunt vermin or boil grass and bark in an attempt to stave off hunger. Disease spread unchecked, especially typhus and dysentery, intensified by contaminated water supplies and overcrowded shelters. Hospitals, improvised in cellars and partially destroyed buildings, were overwhelmed with wounded and sick, operating with minimal medical supplies and under the constant threat of bombardment. Amidst this chaos, an atmosphere of despair and resignation enveloped the city's streets. Nazi propaganda continued broadcasting promises of rescue, despite the glaringly evident futility of such assurances. Public sentiment oscillated between embittered resignation and panic-driven defiance. Many civilians sought ways to escape the encircled city. However, Soviet encirclement was airtight, and escape attempts frequently resulted in capture or death. Some residents, fearing Soviet retaliation, preferred death amid the ruins over surrender. By this stage, Soviet forces had identified critical weaknesses in the German defensive perimeter, primarily in Breslau's southern and western districts. These sectors became focal points of intensified Soviet attacks. The Soviets meticulously coordinated infantry assaults with devastating artillery barrages and aerial strikes, designed to overwhelm defenders systematically. German defensive lines buckled under this sustained pressure, and defenders suffered staggering casualties trying to hold their ground. Yet even as entire battalions were wiped out, survivors regrouped and established new defensive positions deeper within the city, prolonging the siege's agony. Throughout this escalating crisis, Niehoff continued requesting reinforcements from Berlin, receiving only empty promises. Isolated and undersupplied, the German defenders relied increasingly on sheer willpower and improvisation, Ammunition shortages reached critical levels, forcing units into desperate hand-to-hand fighting and guerrilla tactics. Tanks and heavy artillery became increasingly scarce, either destroyed in combat or rendered unusable by lack of fuel and spare parts. The defense devolved into fragmented pockets of isolated resistance, each struggling for survival amid the devastation. For Soviet troops, the siege had become an exhausting and psychologically taxing ordeal. Weeks of relentless urban warfare had taken a severe toll on morale. Infantry units advancing through Breslau faced ambushes, booby traps, and sniper fire with alarming frequency. Soviet commanders grappled with escalating casualty rates, prompting frequent rotations of exhausted frontline troops to maintain combat effectiveness. Despite numerical superiority, frustration mounted as each German stronghold captured seemed only to lead to further fierce resistance. Politically, Breslau's stubborn resistance began to symbolize broader German defiance in the face of certain defeat. Joseph Stalin viewed Breslau's fall as essential, not only strategically but politically, demanding an unequivocal demonstration of Soviet might. Stalin's insistence on capturing Breslau quickly spurred Soviet commanders toward increasingly ruthless tactics, further intensifying the siege's brutality. By the final weeks of April, Fortress Breslau had been reduced to a shattered, apocalyptic ruin. Soviet bombardment left few buildings standing. The cityscape was a smoldering expanse of rubble and twisted metal. Amid these devastated streets, both Soviet and German troops continued their relentless struggle, each side aware that the siege was entering its decisive phase. Yet, even as defeat appeared inevitable, Breslau's remaining defenders prepared themselves for a final, bitter confrontation, determined to resist until all options were exhausted. This tragic scenario set the stage for the siege's catastrophic climax, promising even greater devastation, human suffering, and an outcome defined by strategic futility rather than military triumph. As April 1945 drew toward its close, Fortress Breslau's defense reached a desperate and chaotic climax. General Hermann Niehoff, now fully aware of the hopelessness of his position, continued to urge fierce resistance despite the overwhelming odds. Breslau, isolated and battered relentlessly by Soviet artillery and air assaults, was becoming a city of ghosts, its streets lined with rubble, its buildings hollow shells, and its remaining inhabitants teetering on the brink of total collapse. For Soviet commanders, capturing Breslau remained strategically critical, but the protracted siege had severely drained their troops. Soviet infantry, worn down by weeks of street-to-street fighting, now viewed each ruined building as a potential death trap. Snipers, hidden German machine gun nests, and deadly booby traps made every advance a costly ordeal. In response, Soviet tactics escalated even further in severity. Under direct orders from Marshal Konev, artillery barrages were intensified to unprecedented levels, systematically reducing Breslau's urban landscape to scorched earth, denying German defenders any remaining cover or defensive advantage. The final weeks of April saw the most savage combat yet. Soviet soldiers fought tirelessly to eliminate Breslau's remaining defensive positions, often resorting to close-quarters combat, grenade duels, and flamethrowers to flush German defenders from fortified basements and tunnels. Each district became a miniaturized battlefield, fiercely contested at enormous human cost. German units, increasingly fragmented and isolated, fought stubbornly, motivated less by strategic hope than by ideological fanaticism, fear of Soviet retribution, or simply desperate survival instinct. Within the city's besieged perimeter, conditions had deteriorated beyond imagination. Civilians, trapped in cellars beneath continuous bombardment, endured starvation, disease, and constant fear. Food had essentially vanished. Survivors subsisted on whatever they could scavenge. Rats, boiled leather, and weeds became desperate staples of survival. Medical supplies were exhausted, leaving wounded soldiers and sick civilians to suffer unaided in overcrowded makeshift hospitals. Typhus, dysentery, and infections ravaged the population unchecked, adding an invisible layer of devastation atop the siege's brutal physical violence. Despite these horrific realities, Nazi propaganda continued circulating throughout the city, proclaiming imminent relief. Radio broadcasts and posters urged continued resistance, promoting the illusion of a miraculous German counter-offensive. However, few defenders or civilians retained any genuine belief in these assurances. Instead, their motivation increasingly stemmed from sheer desperation, fear of Soviet retaliation, or hopeless resignation. Soviet commanders, increasingly frustrated, intensified their assault in a final push to crush Breslau's defenses decisively. Key assaults targeted the city's heart, aiming at strategic buildings and fortified strongpoints identified as crucial to the German defense. Red Army units launched concentrated attacks upon these locations, employing carefully coordinated artillery bombardments, followed immediately by infantry and armored thrusts. Soviet commanders recognized this costly strategy as essential. Breaking Breslau's core defenses would decisively shatter German resistance and finally end the prolonged siege. German resistance during this critical period was tenacious yet clearly deteriorating. Ammunition supplies, already critically low, dwindled toward complete exhaustion. Soldiers scavenged weapons and ammunition from fallen comrades, improvising tactics out of sheer necessity. Tanks and heavy artillery pieces lay immobilized, destroyed, or abandoned, leaving infantrymen with small arms and grenades as their only meaningful defense. The systematic breakdown of communications between units and command centers exacerbated confusion, leaving isolated pockets of resistance to fight independently, often unaware of broader tactical developments. By late April, Breslau's defense had essentially devolved into chaotic urban guerrilla warfare. Civilians and remaining troops formed defensive units that operated largely without central command, relying instead on localized initiative and survival instincts. Streets and buildings changed hands repeatedly, sometimes several times within a single day. German commanders, unable to deliver meaningful tactical direction, watched as their once disciplined defense fragmented into scattered, independent pockets of desperate resistance. This fragmentation only deepened Soviet frustration as their careful tactical planning became increasingly irrelevant. Instead, Soviet infantry units faced constant surprise attacks, ambushes, and sniper fire, often inflicted by isolated German fighters clinging to ruined buildings. Soviet casualties surged dramatically, prompting commanders to authorize even heavier bombardments, aiming to eradicate hidden German resistance through overwhelming firepower rather than costly infantry assaults alone. For Breslau's civilians, this phase marked the siege's ultimate descent into hellish chaos. Many families lost contact, separated by shellfire or forced relocation within the city's ruins. Elderly, wounded, and children suffered disproportionately, lacking both nourishment and medical care. Despite relentless suffering, many civilians continued performing vital support roles for the defenders, clearing rubble, transporting ammunition, and caring for the wounded, often under continuous Soviet fire. On April 30th, news of Adolf Hitler's suicide in Berlin reached Breslau, initially via Soviet loudspeaker broadcasts intended to demoralize defenders. The psychological impact was devastating. While Nazi leadership immediately labeled the announcement Soviet propaganda, many German soldiers and civilians suspected its authenticity. The revelation triggered widespread despair and further eroded morale, hastening the psychological collapse already well underway. Still, Breslau's surviving defenders stubbornly resisted, refusing to surrender en masse. Small units continued fighting, clinging to ruins, tunnels, and cellars, determined to delay the city's inevitable fall. But, by now, the siege had drained them beyond their capacity to maintain organized resistance. Soviet forces, sensing the decisive moment approaching, redoubled their efforts to capture the city, committing fresh troops and intensifying their relentless bombardment. As the month drew to a close, the siege entered its final stages. Fortress Breslau, once proud and defiant, was reduced to a ruinous expanse of scorched rubble, its inhabitants exhausted, starving, and traumatized. Yet even amid this overwhelming devastation, a core of defenders prepared themselves for the siege's bitter end, unwilling or unable to accept defeat until no alternative remained. Thus, as April transitioned into May, Fortress Breslau approached its tragic conclusion, a conclusion defined less by victory or defeat than by the unimaginable human cost exacted upon a city that had come to symbolize the ultimate futility and horror of total war. By the beginning of May 1945, Fortress Breslau's bitter resistance was rapidly approaching its tragic conclusion. Adolf Hitler's suicide in Berlin on April 30th reverberated profoundly throughout the city, fundamentally altering the psychology of defense. Though Nazi leadership initially dismissed the news as Soviet propaganda, German soldiers and civilians increasingly sensed its truth. This revelation eroded the last shreds of hope for a miraculous reversal of fortune, plunging defenders into a deeper, irreversible despair. General Hermann Niehoff, confronting the collapse of German command authority in Berlin, faced the stark reality of holding a fortress city that was effectively lost. Communication with higher headquarters had nearly ceased, and promised reinforcements and supplies had never arrived. Niehoff's isolated command bunker became increasingly irrelevant as local commanders and their units operated autonomously, motivated primarily by personal survival or fanatical resolve rather than cohesive strategic objectives. Within Breslau, the surviving Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, and Hitler Youth units had become fragmented into isolated pockets, fighting independently amid the city's rubble-strewn ruins. Ammunition reserves were virtually exhausted. Defenders relied upon hand-to-hand combat, small arms fire, and improvised explosives to mount stubborn resistance against Soviet assaults. Remaining German armored vehicles lay immobilized, destroyed, or abandoned for lack of fuel and ammunition, forcing infantrymen to hold defensive positions without effective support. Simultaneously, Soviet commanders, under relentless pressure from Marshal Ivan Konev to end the siege quickly, prepared a final, decisive push. By May, Soviet forces surrounding Breslau had been significantly reinforced, bringing additional artillery batteries, tanks, and fresh infantry units to bear. Soviet commanders carefully planned a massive, coordinated assault, meticulously timing infantry advances to follow devastating artillery barrages designed to annihilate remaining German strongpoints and suppress defensive fire. The last days of fighting were particularly savage. Soviet troops, frustrated by prolonged resistance and mounting casualties, showed little mercy. As Soviet artillery systematically flattened Breslau's few remaining intact buildings, infantry units stormed forward, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat against surviving defenders. Flamethrowers, grenades, and heavy machine gun fire punctuated these final clashes, turning entire neighborhoods into battlegrounds littered with corpses and twisted wrecks. Within these horrific conditions, civilian suffering reached unparalleled extremes. Civilians, trapped underground or huddled in ruined buildings, endured starvation, disease, and constant terror under continuous Soviet bombardment. By early May, food supplies had vanished entirely, forcing survivors into desperate acts of scavenging amid hazardous conditions. Disease outbreaks, particularly typhus and dysentery, raged uncontrollably, claiming countless civilian lives. Hospitals, long overwhelmed, ceased functioning as medical supplies completely disappeared, leaving wounded soldiers and civilians alike to suffer without hope of aid. Amid this chaos, Soviet psychological operations intensified dramatically. Loudspeaker broadcasts relentlessly urged defenders to surrender, promising humane treatment while warning of severe consequences for continued resistance. Pamphlets dropped from aircraft underscored Germany's defeat, encouraging Breslau's defenders to abandon hopeless resistance. These propaganda efforts, coupled with the tangible news of Hitler's death, significantly undermined morale, prompting increasing numbers of German soldiers and civilians to surrender individually or in small groups, despite fears of Soviet retaliation. Nonetheless, a fanatical minority remained fiercely committed to holding out until the very end. Many feared Soviet vengeance more than death itself, driven by Nazi propaganda and credible reports of Soviet atrocities elsewhere in Germany. Others continued fighting due to a deeply ingrained ideological fanaticism, unwilling or unable to accept defeat. Their stubborn, fragmented resistance prolonged the siege's agony, even as strategic defeat had become inevitable. By May 4th, General Niehoff confronted the unavoidable collapse of organized resistance. Breslau's remaining territory had shrunk dramatically, forcing defenders into a cramped perimeter around the city's central districts. Soviet artillery and infantry assaults had successfully dismantled critical German strongpoints, leaving only isolated, beleaguered pockets of desperate fighters scattered amid ruins. Finally acknowledging the futility of further resistance, Niehoff considered the necessity of surrender to prevent further senseless slaughter. Communication with Soviet commanders began quietly through intermediaries, cautiously exploring terms of capitulation. Yet, these negotiations proceeded slowly, complicated by mutual distrust and bitter resentment engendered by months of brutal fighting. Meanwhile, combat continued unabated, claiming more lives each hour. Soviet forces intensified their bombardment, determined to hasten Breslau's fall and demonstrate decisively the futility of continued German resistance. The city's streets became death traps, continually contested by fragmented groups of German defenders and relentless Soviet assault teams. In these last desperate days, soldiers on both sides fought with grim determination, each recognizing Breslau's siege was now in its horrific endgame. For Breslau's civilians, the siege's climax marked unimaginable suffering, compounded by uncertainty and terror regarding their immediate future. Families, shattered by casualties and separations, sought refuge amid smoldering ruins, their hopes reduced merely to survival. The psychological trauma inflicted upon survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, would endure long after guns fell silent. As the fighting entered its final hours, Soviet commanders methodically cleared remaining pockets of resistance, progressively tightening their stranglehold upon the city's center. German defenders, reduced to a handful of battered units, faced stark choices: surrender, flight, or death. Increasing numbers chose surrender, exhausted beyond human limits and recognizing continued resistance was futile. Finally, on May 6, 1945, General Niehoff agreed formally to the unconditional surrender of Fortress Breslau. The siege, lasting an agonizing 82 days, ended amid profound devastation and staggering human cost. Soviet soldiers entered the ruined city cautiously, wary of lingering resistance. Streets littered with bodies, burned-out vehicles, and shattered buildings provided stark testimony to the siege's horrifying intensity. Yet even after surrender, the city's nightmare was not over. Breslau faced immediate humanitarian catastrophe, as tens of thousands of surviving residents emerged into the devastated landscape, confronting shortages of food, medicine, and shelter. Soviet occupation brought its own suffering, including widespread violence, looting, and atrocities against civilians. Breslau's tragic legacy, one defined by ideological fanaticism, senseless destruction, and human tragedy, continued unfolding, underscoring the devastating consequences of war's most extreme brutality. In the immediate aftermath of Breslau's surrender on May 6, 1945, the shattered city stood as a haunting testament to war's brutal capacity for destruction. After enduring 82 days of relentless siege, bombardment, and combat, the fortress city was reduced to a desolate wasteland of rubble and ash. Soviet soldiers, weary and embittered by their prolonged ordeal, entered cautiously, moving among ruins filled with debris, corpses, and abandoned weaponry, silent monuments to months of bitter urban warfare. General Hermann Niehoff's formal surrender marked the cessation of organized resistance, but isolated skirmishes and sporadic gunfire echoed through Breslau's devastated streets for days afterward. Many individual German soldiers and small groups, either unaware of the official surrender or unwilling to trust Soviet assurances, continued resisting briefly until forced into surrender or eliminated by Soviet patrols. The city's defenders, consisting of Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and civilian combatants, suffered enormous losses during the siege. Thousands had perished, their remains often hastily buried in shallow graves or left amid ruins, creating a grim landscape of devastation. For Soviet commanders, Breslau's surrender was both a victory and a costly lesson. Marshal Ivan Konev, though triumphant, recognized the immense human and material costs his forces had paid to capture the city. Soviet casualties were significant, estimates ranging into tens of thousands wounded or killed, reflecting the extraordinarily brutal nature of urban combat. Furthermore, the the siege's duration had diverted critical resources, manpower, and equipment away from the assault on Berlin, complicating Soviet strategic planning during the war's decisive final weeks. Yet, despite these bitter losses, Soviet occupation quickly established a harsh, uncompromising regime. Breslau's survivors faced immediate reprisals, arbitrary arrests, and violence. Soviet soldiers, fueled by anger, exhaustion, and vengeance, often exacted brutal retribution against captured German combatants and civilian populations alike. Widespread looting, violence, and assaults on civilians occurred during the initial days of occupation, leaving deep scars upon the city's traumatized inhabitants. In addition to direct violence, Breslau faced an immediate humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands of survivors, many of them women, children, elderly, and wounded soldiers, emerged from hiding places, cellars, basements, tunnels, and ruins, into streets devoid of infrastructure or basic amenities. Food supplies were virtually non-existent, medical care impossible, and clean water scarce. Disease outbreaks, especially typhus, rapidly worsened, exacerbated by overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and complete collapse of public health facilities. The Soviets initially responded with limited humanitarian measures, prioritizing security over civilian relief. German prisoners and surviving civilians were quickly mobilized into labor gangs tasked with clearing rubble, removing bodies, and constructing temporary shelters. Conditions within these forced labor battalions were harsh and frequently brutal, driven by urgent demands from Soviet authorities eager to assert control and restore minimal infrastructure. Many died during these forced labor efforts, their bodies adding to Breslau's grim toll. Politically, the city entered a period of profound upheaval. The defeat of Nazi Germany triggered massive geopolitical changes throughout Europe, particularly in territories directly occupied by Soviet forces. Breslau, historically a German city, found itself at the epicenter of territorial adjustments and population transfers dictated by the victorious Allies. At the Potsdam Conference later in 1945, Breslau and surrounding territories were formally transferred to Poland, a decision reshaping the region's cultural and ethnic landscape permanently. For Breslau's surviving German residents, this political transition meant displacement, uncertainty, and trauma. Within months of the surrender, Polish authorities began organizing massive population transfers. Tens of thousands of surviving Germans were forcibly expelled westward into Germany proper, leaving behind homes, belongings, and generations of cultural identity. Polish settlers, themselves displaced by shifting eastern borders, arrived in Breslau, renaming the city Wrocław, and beginning a difficult process of reconstruction amid ruins and grief. For Soviet commanders, Breslau served as a crucial logistical and administrative hub immediately following its surrender. Occupation authorities prioritized restoring limited rail lines, roads, and infrastructure, essential for military supply and troop movements westward. Despite these urgent efforts, Soviet attention remained heavily focused on Berlin's ongoing battles, often leaving Breslau survivors to fend largely for themselves during the chaotic early months after surrender. International observers, including representatives from Allied nations, eventually gained access to the city, documenting and confirming the extent of its devastation. The once grand historic center, previously adorned with medieval cathedrals, universities, and elegant buildings, lay in ruins. These early reports highlighted the siege's catastrophic humanitarian consequences, drawing international attention and sympathy, but yielding minimal immediate practical assistance for survivors. Culturally and psychologically, Breslau's German residents confronted profound trauma and grief. The city they once knew had vanished, replaced by smoldering ruins, mass graves, and memories of unimaginable violence. Soviet occupation compounded these traumas, reinforcing a sense of defeat, loss, and cultural displacement. Survivors struggled to reconcile memories of pre-war prosperity with the harsh reality confronting them, experiencing collective trauma that would endure through generations. As weeks passed into months, Breslau, now Wrocław, began tentative reconstruction efforts under Polish and Soviet oversight. Yet recovery proved painstakingly slow and complex. hindered by continued political uncertainty, material shortages, and the deep psychological wounds inflicted upon survivors. Initial reconstruction prioritized basic infrastructure, clearing rubble, restoring transportation routes, and providing minimal shelter. Though it took decades before Breslau recovered fully, both physically and culturally. In historical memory, the siege of Fortress Breslau endures as a powerful symbol of wartime suffering and ideological fanaticism. The city's prolonged resistance, although strategically futile, illustrated the extremes of human resilience and determination under conditions of absolute desperation. Yet its fall, and the immense suffering experienced by civilians and soldiers alike, underscored war's catastrophic human costs, particularly when driven by ideological fanaticism and uncompromising strategic doctrine. Thus, as Breslau transitioned from battlefield to occupied city, it embarked upon a difficult journey toward recovery and reconciliation, a process overshadowed continuously by the siege's bitter legacy and profound human trauma.